Resident Evil Extinction, a novelization by Keith R.A. De Candido. Chapter 5. Before. They told Jill Valentine she was insane. They told her she was rumor-mongering. That what she was telling everyone was, in fact, the realm of video games and action movies, not real life. That she was seeing things, that she was mistaken, that she was overreacting. Then, when the truth came out, when the same undead creatures she'd fought off in the forests of the Arklay Mountains invaded Raccoon City proper, to the point where the Umbrella Corporation had had to seal the city, Jill had made damn sure she got out. Alongside two former members of Umbrella Security, Carlos Oliveira and Alice Abernathy, as well as Angie Ashford, the child of another Umbrella bigwig, and a street thug named L.J. Wayne. Jill had gotten out. She even had video footage taken by the late Terry Morales, the Raccoon 7 weather reporter. She had thought that having video proof, not to mention a nuked city, would be enough to bring those Umbrella jerks down. Carlos and Alice both had warned her that Umbrella's reach was long, that it was more powerful than any world government, that it could even make the nuking of a city go away. And they were right. Worse, Jill and Carlos had been named as fugitives. Umbrella used her suspension after reporting the zombies in Arklay against her, not to mention Morales' own history of faking footage to get a story. Morales had been a news reporter until she showed footage of a councilman taking a bribe that turned out to be fake, thus relegating her to the weather. Like all the best liars, Umbrella used a grain of truth to make its falsehood more convincing. Carlos had managed to forge papers that would allow them to get Alice out of the San Francisco facility, something Angie had insisted they do. But they had to get out of California as fast as possible after that, as there was no way Carlos's forgery would hold up for more than 5 minutes. So they wound up in the middle of nowhere in Idaho. Jill knew it was the middle of nowhere because they'd gone through a considerable patch of nowhere before finally arriving at the middle of it. They'd checked into some dump. LJ had jokingly called it the It'll Do Motel, and plotted out their next move while sitting in one of the rooms. It was barely big enough to fit the 2 double beds and a bureau with a battered television on top of it. The end table between the beds had a lamp with a flickering bulb, a remote for the TV, and a Gideon Bible next to the phone book in the drawer. Both books had many pages ripped out. Besides the door leading outside, there were 2 other doors, one to the adjacent room, which Carlos and LJ were sleeping in, and one to the tiny bathroom. The toilet made strange gurgling noises every few minutes, which Jill just knew was going to keep her up all night. The walls were covered either in stained puce wallpaper or large, awful, abstract paintings. It was even money as far as Jill was concerned which of the 2 hurt her eyes more. Still, it was cheap, and they took cash. LJ insisted he had plenty of credit cards they could use, but Jill found herself strangely unwilling to commit credit card fraud until they got really desperate. LJ had snorted and said, "Once a cop, huh?" The motel also had a back alley between 2 long buildings that provided a handy escape route, if one was willing to crawl out through a dirty, old, sealed window that Alice had managed to force open. A quick escape was something they might need. They did their best not to get noticed on their way here from San Francisco, but the number of people after them, and with the resources those people commanded. Now they sat around on the 2 beds in the women's room, plotting out their next move. Carlos's contact, who'd gotten them the forged papers, had stopped answering the cell phone. I've got a bad feeling that they made him disappear. They're good at that, Alice said. We need to get this information out to someone Umbrella can't touch, Jill said. And who would that be exactly? Carlos asked. Umbrella made significant campaign contributions to the chair of every important committee in Congress and each of the last 4 presidents. Umbrella lobbyists are all over D.C. rewriting laws to suit them. Jill exploded. They blew up the city, Carlos. No, a nuclear plant melted down, Carlos said snidely. Didn't you see it on the news? The very same news outlets that we gave copies of Terry's tape to. Umbrella owns half the TV news outlets and 3/4 of the print ones. They don't own all of it, though, do they? LJ asked. There are a few independent stations, Alice said, but Umbrella was at least a piece of most of them. It'd be impossible to get this done through the mainstream press. I'm surprised you even bothered trying. All it did was put you 2 on the most wanted list. Jill ignored Alice's criticism. She hated to admit it, but LJ was on the right track. So screw the mainstream, she pointed at the laptop that sat next to Angie. Put the video online. That whole stuff with Clinton and the intern, LJ said, that happened because some jerk online, right? Matt Drudge, Alice said. Drudge is a jackass with delusions of grandeur, Carlos said. Maybe, Jill said, suddenly feeling energized. But it's people like him who will get this story out. The people who don't give a damn about corporate sponsorship. The numbers are meaningless, Alice said. A few thousand people, maybe. For the first time, Angie spoke. It's a few thousand more than know now, though, isn't it? Girl's got herself a point, LJ said. Alice shrugged and got up from the bed. Fine. We put it online. That can't be all we do, though. She thought a moment. Treasury. LJ grinned. Well, we gonna rob Fort Knox to finance the revolution? I'm down with that. Is a felony your answer to everything, LJ? Jill asked. Nah, I'm strictly misdemeanor. Jill shook her head. LJ was a cockroach, a 2-bit hustler who made his living on a small-time stuff. He'd gone through the Raccoon City Police Department in handcuffs 6 times a month, and he usually got kicked by dropping a dime on someone. LJ had his fingers in many pies and knew to give up little enough so that he didn't piss off the people on the street, but not so little that it wouldn't be worth the cop's time. It was a delicate balancing act, and Jill knew that several uniforms were looking forward to the day that he lost his balance, and they could bust him proper. That day would never come, of course. Jill was the only member of the RCPD still alive, while LJ, like any good cockroach, survived the Holocaust. She was amazed he hadn't bailed yet. Alice was explaining herself. What I meant was, I still have some friends in the Treasury Department. It's not much, but those guys are pretty autonomous. If we bring this to the FBI or Congress, the White House could come down on them like a ton of bricks, but even Umbrella's not going to mess with the money or the Secret Service. Carlos shook his head. Yeah, but this isn't the Treasury's jurisdiction. Jill was about to agree when her face suddenly broke into a wide smile. Sure it is. No, he's right, Alice said. I don't see how we can. Secret Service's job is to protect the president, right? Jill asked. Carlos and Alice both nodded. So, Jill went on, only the president is authorized to fire our nuclear weapons, yes? Technically, Alice said, but then she broke into a smile of her own. I like it. It's a stretch, but it's a start. Carlos looked confused. I don't get it. Alice turned to Carlos. By firing a nuclear missile on American soil in a situation that was not a test, they usurped the power of the President of the United States. It's possible that we can convince Treasury that this brands them a threat to the President, which is their jurisdiction. LJ shook his head. Knew I should have been watching the West Wing and stuff. I don't know what y'all are talking about. It's a long shot, Alice said. What's the alternative? Jill asked. We can sit on our butts and run from the feds. The longer we wait, the easier it'll be for Umbrella to cover this up. We gotta get people picking at the scab before it has a chance to heal." "It's done." That was Angie. Jill and the others all turned toward the bed to see what she had opened the laptop and was using it. "What's done?" "I put the video online, all the footage of Raccoon City and your confession. I had to put it in 2 separate bits, since the website I'm using only lets me put up videos up to 2 minutes at a time." "Angie," Alice said in a panicky voice, "if they can trace it—" "They can't," Angie spoke with the classic give-me-a-break tone that all children knew instinctively. Jill, God knew, had used it on her parents often enough when she was Angie's age. "I used an untraceable email address and used one of my father's programs to mask the IP address. No one will know where it came from." "How did you get online?" Carlos asked. "Don't tell me this place is wireless." Angie grinned. "No, but someone who lives nearby does, and they never changed their network key from the default." Alice grinned right back. "Your father teach you how to do that?" "Actually, I taught him." They all got a good chuckle out of that, even though Jill didn't entirely believe it. Whenever she'd used that know-it-all tone at Angie's age, she was usually about 100% wrong. But like all kids, she didn't realize it until she was a grown-up and discovered how much more complicated the world was. Then again, Angie had a pretty good idea about that. Like Alice, she was swimming with the T-virus, which had regenerated her legs. Those limbs were atrophied at birth, a hereditary condition she got from her wheelchair-bound father, but the T-virus, along with a regular dose of the antivirus, both of which Angie kept in a Spider-Man lunchbox that never left her side, had regenerated the limbs to working condition. Dr. Charles Ashford's own body was too far gone for the T-virus to help him, but his daughter was young enough to be able to regenerate the muscles and nerves that needed strengthening. Then, according to what Alice and Angie had both told them, the research was taken away from Ashford. He had wanted to use the virus as a tool for healing. Umbrella, which owned the patents of anything Ashford or anyone else created while working for it, took it away from him and turned it into the basis of a wrinkle cream that they could sell for millions, and a bioweapon that could sell for billions. According to Alice, the project had been given over to 2 younger, more malleable doctors in the hive named Mariano Rodriguez and Anna Bolt, who had been refining it into something more fitting with Umbrella's corporate mandate. Bolt and Rodriguez had been infected when one of Alice's co-workers, Spence Parks, let the virus loose in their office. Their legacy, however, lived on in Raccoon. Jill took some solace in the fact that, if nothing else, Umbrella nuking Raccoon meant that the virus had been stopped. The only infected people were Alice and Angie. "If we done yappin'," LJ said, grabbing the remote off the end table and leaning back against the headboard, "I ain't seen Oprah in a month, and I'm sufferin' withdrawal." When he switched on the TV, it showed the motel's menu options, including a pay-per-view selection that Jill suspected was mostly of the adult variety, and he flipped forward to the first channel. Before he could flip further, Carlos said, "Stop. Hang on, LJ." It was a news report, the words, "Outbreak in San Francisco" under the anchor's concerned features. The Mission Hill district has been quarantined, and representatives from the Centers for Disease Control will be on the scene shortly. "What's the big—" Jill started, then she noticed the image over the anchor's shoulder, showing someone who looked suspiciously like one of the infected people in Raccoon. The anchor went on, "The cause of the disease is unknown. However, the symptoms include delirium, a milkiness to the eyes, and a desire to, well, bite people. There is concern that those infected might transmit the disease through biting, hence the quarantine." Jill just shook her head. "The bastards let it out," Alice said. "That has to be it." "No," Carlos said. "Even Umbrella wouldn't." "They did it before," Alice said. Kane reopened the hive, and Kane's dead, Jill pointed out. An umbrella wouldn't deliberately infect another city. They wouldn't be able to pull the same trick twice. She looked at the television, seeing a street reporter interviewing a San Francisco cop. But they didn't have to. Think about it. Tons of people were plowing through the Ravensgate Bridge. Maybe somebody got through who was infected, or maybe somebody got out before Umbrella sealed off the city, or somebody else broke through like we did, or maybe it's some stray employee who got through the screening. Who knows? And made it all the way to San Francisco, which just happens to be where Isaacs relocated his lab? Jill sighed. All right, maybe they screwed up an experiment. Who cares? The point is, we've got something now. We've just received word that the RPC, the Reserve Physician Corps, is also sending medical assistance to aid local medical personnel in identifying and containing this disease. That's that, Alice said. What's what? Jill asked. Carlos sighed. RPC is a division of Umbrella. They've already gone in with a syringe in one hand and whitewash in the other. Maybe, but it may not work this time. Raccoon was isolated, a small company town on an island. But San Francisco? Jill smiled. There's too much city there, and Umbrella doesn't have the same pull that they had in Raccoon. This might be just what we need. Angie said in a small voice, So people dying is a good thing? Jill winced, a heaviness in her chest. Angie, I know, Jill, Angie said, sounding almost depressingly mature. The light flickered again, just as the toilet made its gurgling noise, and suddenly Jill had a tremendous need for air. I'm going to go smoke, she said. Actually, Carlos said we could use some food. I saw about 12 different fast food joints when we drove in. Jill nodded. Now that Carlos had said it out loud, she realized she was starving. Her stomach gurgled for good measure, in almost perfect harmony with the toilet. Fine, burgers, fries, and chicken for everyone. Yeah, LJ said with a grin, stretching the word to 3 syllables. I be living on grease, yo. Why am I not surprised? Jill said with an exaggerated sigh. As she went outside to the small covered walkway that bordered the motel parking lot, she pulled her cigarette pack out of her pocket. Only one left. Hoping that there was a deli or something with all these fast food joints Carlos mentioned, she took out her matchbook. Only one match left, too. She folded the matchbook shut for a second and stared at it. The stylized logo of McSorley's Bar and Grill stared back at her. For a second, she was scared to strike the match, as if the act of doing it would cut off her last connection to Raccoon City. Jill had been born and raised in Raccoon. A lot of her youth was misspent at McSorley's hustling pool. While her friends were waitressing or working at fast food joints for their pocket money, Jill was in McSorley's, drinking Diet Cokes so old Eamon McSorley wouldn't lose his liquor license, and fooling guys into thinking that the cute teenage brunette didn't know an 8-ball from a tennis ball right before she took them for all they were worth. Once she got into the police academy, she had to stop hustling, of course, or as she preferred to call it, educating. Eamon had given her a neon Budweiser sign as a going-away present in gratitude for all the business she'd brought into the bar. Once she got a rep, everyone wanted to take down the pool girl. The bar was gone now, so was McSorley's, so presumably was Eamon himself, if the T-virus didn't get the cantankerous old bastard the nuke did, and so was her Budweiser sign. The matchbook was all she had left. It was funny. Jill had been set to leave Raccoon altogether. If Umbrella hadn't put up a wall on Ravensgate, she would have driven right out and not looked back. Not at her brownstone, not at her job, not at anything. Not that she was all that hot to return to the job in any case. They had told her to go off and die, and she had no family anymore anyhow, so the only things she left behind in Raccoon were things that, she had told herself, could easily be replaced. And yet, where would she find another McSorley's matchbook? Suddenly she burst out laughing. The matchbook was, after all, the absolute least of her problems. The U.S. government wanted her for questioning in the perpetration of a fraud on the American public and slander against a fine American corporation. The same fine American corporation whose orders forced the RCPD to mess up her life and suspend her when she had the temerity to tell the truth about those things in the Arklay Mountains. Shaking her head, Jill lit the last match and took a long, wonderful drag on the last cigarette. The really funny part was that right before she was suspended, she was considering trying to quit smoking. So much for that crazy idea. She walked down to the first fast food place that presented itself and went in once she was done with her cigarette. As she waited in line, she decided to buy enough burgers, fries, and chicken for 10 people. Sure, there were only 5 of them, but Angie was a growing girl. God knew what Alice's metabolism was like now, and LJ struck her as the type who could eat for 4. During the whole time she had walked in and stood in line, something had been nagging at the back of her brain, but she couldn't figure out what. Then finally, just as she got to the front of the line, she caught it. There was somebody in the fast food place, a short guy in a big coat that was too warm for the weather, but just the right size to conceal a shoulder holster as well as a ball cap and sunglasses. He looked outside right when a car drove by that slowed down as it passed the fast food place. Right when he did that, the car headed off in the same direction as the hotel. Jill had been made. She cursed herself up, down, backward, and sideways. If they'd traced the SUV to this podunk town, the first thing they'd do was check fast food places, since it was the ideal location for people on the run, seeing as how you could get quick food for cash. Jill remembered a lecture given to the academy while she was there by a member of the fugitive squad from an East Coast PD. She could no longer remember which one, who said that the best way to find someone who's hiding is to track the pizza joints, fast food places, and Chinese restaurants. There were at least 3 of them, 1 here and 2 more in the car. Probably a bunch in the other joints. Calmly, Jill ordered the food, but only enough for herself. There was a cigarette machine outside the place, so she set the bag down there and bought herself another pack, which conveniently came with a matchbook. Then she pulled one out and lit it up. She did not rush. The worst thing she could do right now was give the appearance that she knew she'd been made. If they knew the others were in the motel, nothing she could do would help them. And if they didn't know for sure, she needed to lull them into a false sense of security. That was why she only got enough food for herself. It was possible she was being paranoid, of course, that it was just some guy and the car slowed down for some other reason. But every instinct Jill had said that she was made, and Jill's instincts had been wrong only once before, when she reported the creatures in the Arklays, assuming that Captain Henderson would back her up. Calmly, she walked back to the hotel room, slipping in quickly enough that no one could see who else was in the room. "Damn, that ain't enough to feed a bird." To LJ, she said, "Shut up. I got made. There was someone watching in the fast food joint, and he signaled a car here." "You sure?" Alice asked. "Not 100%, but sure enough." Carlos got up and grabbed his 9mm. "We've got to get out of here." "Yeah, you do." Alice stared at Jill. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You know what it means." "To hell with that," Carlos said. "We're not letting you." "You don't have a choice," Jill snapped. "They know I'm here. They don't know you're here. If they barge in and find nobody, they'll keep looking. If they barge in and find me, I can stall them, make them think I was here alone, and that'll give you more time." She smiled grimly. "Just leave me the tape." "You flippin'?" LJ said as he started packing up what gear he had. "Without that tape, you've got copies. Angie has it on her laptop, and we've still got some DVDs and VHS tapes with it. Take those, but leave me the original." "It's too risky," Carlos said. "No," Alice said, "she's right. If those are the feds out there, they can verify that the tape's real. Best to do that with Terry's original. And then Umbrella will waltz right in, and Carlos started, but Jill wouldn't let him finish. Maybe they will, but there's a chance they won't. If they don't get their hands on the original, though, there's no chance they will. Which do you prefer? Jill stared at Carlos for several seconds. Finally, he nodded. Within seconds, everyone had gathered up everything and slid out the window that Alice had busted open. LJ first, followed by Angie, whom he caught. Carlos was next. This is crazy. No crazier than anything else that's happened to us the last 3 weeks. Besides, this needs to be done, and I'm the best person to do it. Yeah, be safe. After Carlos clambered through the old window, Alice walked up to Jill and put a hand on her shoulder. Thank you. Someone pounded on the door. Federal agents, open up! You're welcome, Jill said. Now get your ass out of here. As soon as Alice was through the window, Jill closed it and jammed it shut again. With luck, they wouldn't be able to tell that someone had climbed through it. Forensic technology might reveal that the window had been used in due time, but by then, Carlos and the others would be long gone. A quick eyeballing of the room wouldn't reveal anything untoward, which was all that mattered. Jill called out, "Hang on, I'm in the bathroom," as she ran over to that place and flushed the gurgling toilet. Then she walked to the front door to see 4 men wearing blue jackets and Ray-Bans, one of whom looked a lot like the guy in the fast food place, holding guns at the ready. She smiled sweetly. "Can I help you guys?" Chapter 6. After. Claire Redfield had long since stopped noticing when the Hummer ran over one of the zomboids. Otto had started calling them that as an alternative to LJ's nickname, which was zombie-ass mofos. Given that they had kids in the convoy, not to mention the excess number of syllables, it was generally felt that a better neologism was required. Claire had nixed zombies simply because you couldn't take the word seriously. It conjured up images of bad movies and worse comic books. Zombies were fictional. The walking, lumbering, feeding corpses were very real, and they were growing in numbers, in direct proportion to how the human population was shrinking. A part of Claire was convinced that the 30 of them were the last humans alive. She looked up briefly at the sun visor. The picture she'd clipped there was ragged at the edges and faded after a few years of exposure to sunlight, but it was still clearly a picture of Claire and her brother Chris from their trip to Florida. Then she fixed her eyes back on the road. Not that it was necessary. Aside from the occasional zomboid that the Hummer smashed into, they were alone on the road, which in the California desert was pretty straight. Claire wasn't entirely sure that zomboid was a better alternative, but Otto used it once, and it stuck. The Hummer bounced slightly. The suspension was such that a simple pothole wouldn't have been that noticeable. Although, given that the roads hadn't been maintained in a few years, even simple potholes got pretty large. So Claire figured it was another zomboid. That was fine with her. Quickly, she checked the side view to make sure everyone was there. She could see everything except the 8x8, bringing up the rear, and she could only see the news truck because of the gigunda antenna poking up past even the oil truck. But assuming Carlos hadn't veered the 8x8 into a ditch without telling anyone, they were all there. The ambulance they'd found abandoned in Dallas, furbished with medical supplies they'd looted from everywhere they could, the school bus from the Omaha public school system, which served as the main living accommodation and had been tricked out with gun ports and armor plating, taken from both the San Diego Naval Yards and Fort Irwin, an Enco oil tanker that was jackknifed on I-70 somewhere in Missouri, 3 zomboids at the wheel and full when they'd liberated it, and a news truck from a Denver TV station. Bracketing these vehicles in the front and rear were 2 more gifts from Fort Irwin, a Humvee leading and an 8x8 guarding their tracks. By the time they had reached Irwin, at that point the convoy consisted only of the school bus, the ambulance, and the news truck. These two were the only vehicles that weren't wrecked or stolen, or in one case, blown up in order to stop the zomboid soldiers that had overrun the place. Claire would have preferred a tank, but there wasn't one available. She also would have preferred that Otto and LJ had used some of the base's munitions to blow up those zomboids instead of one of the 3 remaining working vehicles. But beggars and choosers and all that. Claire was just grateful to be alive. She looked up at the sun visor and wondered, again, what happened to Chris. Then she shook her head, as she always did, and told herself to stop thinking about it. There was no way to know, and no sense beating herself up about it. 30 people were counting on her and Carlos to keep them alive, and she couldn't do that if she was moping about Chris. Keeping her left hand on the steering wheel, she palmed sweat off her forehead. Aside from the news truck, which needed to keep the equipment inside cool, none of the vehicles in the convoy used air conditioning anymore, as it used up the gas too quickly. As it was, the Enco truck wasn't much more than a big metal can of air storage. They needed to find a refill of gas, and soon. Their difficulty in doing so was one of the things that gave Claire hope that there were other humans still living. Somebody else was looting the remains of human civilization besides them. How else to explain the number of small towns they'd gone through that had already been stripped clean of gas and food and weaponry, like bones after the vultures were done? But all they saw were more zomboids. The convoy had been as many as 60 people at one point, but every time they came up against some zomboids, they lost someone, or several someones. Occasionally they'd pick up new people. The last hospital they'd raided, in Bakersfield, also had a paramedic and a med tech still alive, and they'd joined up. The zomboids weren't the only danger. Having an ambulance was all well and good, but they didn't have any doctors. The paramedic and the med tech were handy in a pinch, but they were recent additions, and Emilio, the med tech, had died soon after joining. Carlos had field medic training, but that also wasn't particularly helpful when someone needed surgery, like Lyndon. Lyndon Berry was a good, kind soul who'd been the camera operator for Denver's KT3. He worked alongside a reporter named Heidi Ellis and a driver named Ross Vincent. They'd been driving all over Denver, reporting on what was going on. When KT3 stopped broadcasting, they put their stories online for as long as they could. By the time the convoy found them, they were in Boulder, being overrun by some zomboids. Carlos and LJ had made quick work of their attackers. They'd had more experience killing these things than anyone else in the group, but not before one bit Heidi. They didn't know that until she died and went zomboid on them, biting Ross and infecting him as well. Claire herself shot both of them in the head. Lyndon hadn't let any of it get to him, remarkably enough. He'd watched the world fall apart around him, dutifully recording it for whatever posterity was left. He'd stood and watched as his best friends and colleagues turned into zomboids, and still he was always ready with a joke or a cheery word. Truly, Claire had envied him that talent. Then one day they were going through a ramshackle old house that had some canned food and old ammunition in the basement, and one of the ceiling supports came crashing down right on Lyndon's leg. They all did the best they could for him, but nobody had the skill actually to fix his leg or even keep the wound clean. No one in the convoy had had a proper shower in years, and there was simply no way even to approach antiseptic conditions. Eventually, Lyndon got gangrene. This was the world they all lived in now, when a sweet, cheerful man could die of a broken leg. Depressed, Claire reached for her pack of cigarettes. The pack collapsed in her grip. Empty. Damn it. She looked into the rear view to see Kmart applying makeup for whatever stupid reason. "Have you been smoking my cigarettes?" Claire had no idea what the girl's real name was. When they had found her in the Kmart in Athens, Georgia, she had refused to provide her name. saying she'd never liked it anyhow, and the people who gave it to her were dead. LJ started calling her Kmart, and she took to it. The 14-year-old wore electrical wire on her left wrist as bracelets. Otto had called it Apocalypse Chic. She had liberated the entire makeup supply of the Kmart where they'd found her and still insisted on using it every day, even though her face, like everyone else's, was filthy. "I don't smoke," Kmart said, not bothering to look up from applying eyeshadow. "Well, don't start," Claire said, crumpling the pack into a tiny ball. "Don't need the competition. Carlos is bad enough." She flung the pack out the window, then grabbed the Army-issue PRC that came with the Hummer. All the convoy vehicles were equipped with them. Radio had become the communications medium of choice, since telephones depended on either wires or satellite towers, which were not reliable anymore. If nothing else, she could make sure that Carlos was still there. "Carlos, this is Claire. Got any smokes?" Carlos Oliveira had a pleasant, reassuring voice. It had enabled him to do well in the Air Force before he resigned his commission to join the Umbrella Corporation, and it had enabled him to be a strong team leader in Umbrella's security division. Carlos had been one of the first people to tell the truth about what was happening in the world, and he had led several military operations that had saved hundreds of lives. For a time, he was in command of a ragtag group of armed forces and police personnel as a sort of last stand against the undead. They called themselves the Strike Team. Eventually, though, the tide of zomboids was just too strong. Carlos and LJ were the only survivors of the Strike Team left. Claire had been one of the refugees Carlos's team had rescued, and eventually she grew into a leadership role. Now Carlos said, in as sincere a voice as he was capable of, "I'm out." However, Claire wasn't having any of it. "I'm supposed to believe that? Would I lie to you, Claire?" Damn it, he wouldn't either. Carlos was honest to a fault, which was one of the several reasons why Claire didn't understand how he could work for Umbrella. For his part, Carlos never had been able to provide a good answer to that question, and he'd certainly been asked it enough times. Sighing, Claire said, "LJ?" "Claire Redfield," LJ said in his usual boisterous tone from his position behind the wheel of the Enco tanker. "Now how can I help you?" Nobody knew much about LJ's past, mostly because he kept making up different ones. Every time someone new came into the convoy, LJ would spin some yarn about who he was. A haberdasher, a shoe repairman, a computer programmer with IBM, a minor league baseball player, a cop, a drug dealer, a federal agent, a deli clerk, and a veterinarian. He had been with Carlos when he had the strike team, and his job was to help out with all the non-military stuff, including keeping the refugees safe. While Claire owed Carlos her life, she owed LJ her sanity. His crazed sense of humor had kept her going through the worst of the despair, especially after she realized that she probably would never see her brother again. What little Claire did know about LJ was something that only one other person in the convoy knew, that he, like Carlos, was a survivor of Raccoon City. It was for that reason that Claire hadn't pried about his past. If it was connected to the city that started the apocalypse, she was just as happy not to open up that old wound. "Got a smoke?" she asked him now. "We talking regular tobacco or alternate substances?" LJ had shown an affinity for pharmaceuticals that led one to think that his claim to have been a drug dealer in the past was pretty close to the mark, and he had managed to scrape together a supply of drugs that weren't FDA approved. Not that there was an FDA to approve it or a law enforcement structure to enforce it. Regular, Claire said. Getting high sounded appealing, but not while she was driving. "No can do," LJ said quickly. Frowning, Claire asked, "How about alternate? Sorry to say we're out of that too." Somehow, Claire wasn't surprised. Betty Greer, the paramedic they'd picked up in Bakersfield, was driving the ambulance, and she chimed in, "You gotta be kidding me, Otto?" From the school bus, Otto Walensky said, "Sorry, campers, smoked the last of it back in Salt Lake." They hadn't been in Salt Lake for almost a month, so Claire was rather amazed that Otto'd been able to hold out this long. He'd been a high school history teacher in Omaha, and he'd been using the bus from his own school system to protect his kids and later other kids who'd been abandoned or orphaned by the growing plague of the undead. "Damn," Betty muttered. "Yeah, people," LJ said portentously. "It really is the end of the world." Otto snorted, "Ladies and gentlemen, or Morale Officer L.J. Wayne." Betty said, "There better be some damn cigarettes in the next town." "So speaketh the medical professional," Otto said, "an inspiration to us all." LJ said, "Man, lung cancer ain't exactly high on the list of stuff I'm concerned about, you feel me?" Claire interrupted the bantering. "Speaking of the next town, shouldn't we be close to something?" "Maybe," Carlos said. "If I remember right, there's a small town coming up soon. If we see a video billboard for Vegas, we're close." "A video billboard," Otto said. "And you expect it to still be working? Why exactly?" "It's solar-powered," Carlos said. When she noticed moving images on the road ahead, right before the road angled downward into a valley, Claire asked, "Does the billboard say, 'What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas'?" "That's the one," Carlos said. "Then everyone pull yourselves over, 'cause we're coming up on it now." Claire pulled the Hummer onto the shoulder of the highway, decelerating at a leisurely pace to give all the other large vehicles time to shed momentum. A car crash would be beyond disastrous. From the back, Kmart said, "I hope this is a real town, not like Pa-Rump." "You keep mentioning Pa-Rump. It's not like it's the only town that was abandoned and half-buried in dunes." A lot of the towns that they'd come across had been half-buried in sand, as if the desert was reclaiming them. In a few more years, there might not have been any sign of Pahrump, or Kettleman Station, or Bakersfield, or Lebec, or any number of other places. "Yeah, but I just like saying it. Pahrump, Pahrump, Pahrump. Who names a town that? The people of Pahrump, apparently," Claire said as she switched the ignition off and opened the door. LJ and Carlos had already gotten out and were running ahead to the billboard, which stood about 30 feet high, in the hopes of getting a better vantage. Claire leaned against the side of the Hummer, Kmart standing next to her, imagining that she was smoking a cigarette. Claire reached in to grab the PRC so she could talk to Carlos and LJ. The pair of them were climbing up the billboard as if it was a set of monkey bars, Carlos moving a bit faster than LJ. Once they got to the top, Carlos took out a pair of binoculars. "This is another one the desert's trying to take back," he said. "Latest in a series. Collect 'em all," LJ said. That last word was stretched out to about 4 syllables. However, Carlos added, "We got us a motel, complete with restaurant, gift shop, and best of all, gas station." "You goddamn Rika!" That was Chase McAvoy, who'd been riding shotgun with LJ in the tanker. A pause. Claire looked up to see that Carlos was taking in the entire view. Finally, he said, "Seems quiet." LJ put in, "Don't they always?" Claire sighed. "Your call." Otto then said, "Whatever you guys decide, can you get a move on? I got a yoga class at 7. That prompted several chuckles. It was also code. The kids were getting restless, and stopping for a while wouldn't be a bad thing. Stopping in a place that at least once was part of Western civilization would be an even better thing. Finally, Carlos said, "I think it's worth a look. I'm not seeing any signs of life or unlife, but as long as we're careful." "Fine," Claire said. "You two go on ahead and scope out the joint." "Copy that." As Carlos and LJ started climbing back down off the billboard that continued to extol the virtues of Las Vegas, a place they'd all been afraid to visit, having learned the hard way that big cities were not safe, Claire hoped and prayed that there would be something left in the gas station. She had very little expectation for food. Anything still left in the restaurant had probably long since spoiled, though the gift shop might have had some jerky or canned food. But what they needed more than fuel for the body was fuel for the convoy. The best way to stay safe was to keep moving. The biggest advantage that the living had over the dead was speed. The zomboids ambulated at a fairly leisurely pace, and weren't capable of the motor functions necessary to operate a moving vehicle. So staying mobile was key, and that required gas. Her last words to Carlos before signing off were, "Good luck."